Some quarterbacks save a franchise, others tear it apart. In 1990, the Indianapolis Colts made one of the most aggressive trades in NFL history to draft a quarterback with one of the strongest arms ever. They believed he was the missing piece to be a contender. But that very arm, the one that made him the #1 pick, would ultimately define his failures. What you saying, guys? It's Zane here. Let's get into it. All it took was a single workout session. After watching Jeff George zip the ball around for a couple hours, the Colts head coach fell in love. Jeff George possessed this raw talent that couldn't be taught, with one of the strongest arms ever, so powerful that one coach said he could throw the ball through a car wash and not get it wet. There was just a small problem. The Colts didn't have the #1 pick, so to acquire it from the Falcons, they had to give up the farm. But quarterback is the most important position in football, so if George really was the guy, it would be worth it. The Colts showed how serious they were by giving Jeff George the largest rookie contract in NFL history at the time, $15 million. The Colts believed they were a quarterback away from being competitive. They did have Eric Dickerson, and they made the playoffs a couple years prior, so it wasn't an outrageous belief. Jeff George really was that talented. The team also relocated from Baltimore not too long ago, so they thought the Indiana native could win over the city. But George's relationship with Indianapolis was complicated. In college, George committed to Purdue. But after that first season, his coach who recruited him was fired. The coach who replaced him was obsessed with the run, and George wasn't going to fit into that system, so he just bailed. Then when he transferred, he originally committed to the University of Miami, but after he was told he had to earn the #1 spot, he bailed again. And so his reputation as a whiner, a quitter, arrogant, and so on would begin. He ended up at rival Illinois, and that just bothered some fans. But maybe the Colts could be his redemption arc. However, the reality was, the Colts were not a quarterback away from being competitive. Despite having a decent rookie season, George and the Colts were heading downwards rather than up. A 7-9 season was followed by an abysmal 1-15 meltdown. The O-line was porous. They allowed 37 sacks in his rookie year, and a league-high 56 sacks in his second season. But what hurt the team the most wasn't his talent, he was pretty good, and the holes they had on the roster could eventually be filled in.
Jeff George had one of the greatest arms in history, one of the quickest releases in history. He had everything you want, franchise quarterback, but he didn't have it here.
George caused a lot of problems off the field. He rejected the concept of leadership, he was the last to arrive to practice and the first to leave, and he relied too much on that rocket arm. But none of that was too surprising. By high school, Jeff George was destined for the NFL. But character tends to be built in struggle, and George experienced very little struggle from the day he picked up a football. He was told he was a generational talent, a future Hall of Famer, and with the arm he had, it's understandable. But the problem was, when he faced real adversity, he crumbled. A strong arm isn't enough to be a good quarterback. There's plenty of intangibles, leadership, accountability, you need to be cool under pressure. So aside from raw talent, George seemed to possess none of those traits. Still, when you have as much hype as George did coming into the NFL, if things don't go well, you're inevitably going to get blamed. But lacking any self-awareness, when the team struggled and the fans brought out the pitchforks, his response? Why do I get booed? Here's the honest answer. Because I'm good and I'm good looking. That 10-cent head, as some critics put it, was his downfall. During a game in 1992, George was benched after a rough performance. He decided to throw his helmet into the ground and scream at his coach. Those kind of outbursts only made things worse. Fans heckled him, his grandmother, they even called him a mama's boy, and that was because in his freshman year at college, he was carted off following an injury, and his mum sat with him as he was carted off. George couldn't handle any of this, and he attempted to force a trade by holding out during the 1993 training camp. It didn't work, he played out the season, but the Colts were done with him at this point. The Falcons, who originally planned to draft him, would come and take their chances, because that arm was just irresistible, and they traded for George in 1994. In the Falcons' offensive scheme, he shined. His best year came in 1995, where he threw for over 4,000 yards, which was a team record, and led them to the playoffs. But Jeff George is Jeff George. I've heard somewhere that you shouldn't trust a guy with 2 first names. Jeff George is giving some credibility to that claim. After such a good 1995 season, he wanted a contract extension, but they couldn't reach a deal. So George would come to resent the front office for this. It reached a climax in week 4 of the 1996 season. The Falcons started 0-3, and against the Eagles were trailing 23-10 late in the third quarter. George then threw an interception and would get benched. He lost it. He launched a stream of unsavory words at his coach on national TV. His coach had to act even if he didn't really want to, so he suspended George, and shortly after he was released. With that moment, George was branded for life. He was described as aloof, arrogant, and more pampered than a Clinton campaign contributor. Whoa, I'm not trying to get political here. That's a Sports Illustrated article. Well, who better to give George a shot at redemption than the Oakland Raiders, the league's former haven for NFL rejects. It was also fitting because some people even started throwing around the nickname Mad Bomber 2 in reference to the legend Cinderella moniker. George was still a physical specimen and had one of the best arms in the league, but when he arrived in Oakland, he declared, "I've been through a lot of turmoil, but it's made me a better person." Debatable, but personality aside, there was no doubt he was still an elite talent. In 1997, he led the NFL in passing yards through a career-high 29 touchdowns and just 9 interceptions. But the Raiders' defense was terrible, and they went 4-12. The coach got fired and John Gruden was hired. Gruden then installed a West Coast offense, which emphasized less of the deep ball, which George was so good at throwing. So instead of adapting, he went rogue. He would admit in an interview, while he followed the play calls on 1st and 2nd down, on 3rd down he would just force it to Tim Brown. After an injury-plagued 1998 season, the Raiders signed Rich Gannon and George was done. You think swearing at a coach on live TV couldn't give you a worse rep? Well, when he looked for a new team in 1999, some coaches chimed in. The most harsh probably came from Mike Holmgren, who said Jeff's not the type of leader you bring into the locker room or to develop a young quarterback. Despite leading the NFL in passing just 2 years earlier, for the first time, people didn't want anything to do with Jeff George. One team would take a chance though. The Vikings signed him to back up Randall Cunningham. Cunningham would actually get injured that season, so George stepped in, went 9-3 through 22 touchdowns, and posted a career-best 95.5 passer rating. He even won a playoff game, throwing 3 touchdowns in a dominant win over the Cowboys. He was so good, Chris Carter and Randy Moss wanted to keep him, but the Vikings were hesitant. They'd just drafted Dante Culpepper. But with teammates finally rooting for him, had he finally changed? You tell me. After he was unable to reach a deal with the Vikings, he would sign with Washington, but when a new head coach was brought in, Marty Schottenheimer, he tried to install a West Coast offense, which led to some more fights. George wanted to just throw it deep as much as possible. After just 8 games, the Redskins cut him. He bounced around a few rosters but never played another NFL snap. Jeff George's career is one of wasted potential. He had the arm talent of a Hall of Famer, but the attitude of a third-string quarterback. That might be an insult to third-string quarterbacks. His reputation became so toxic, nobody wanted to deal with him even when he seemed to change. And yet, you could say his story didn't end in failure. After football, George returned to his hometown and became a community activist. Maybe he changed, maybe he was never that bad to begin with. Only Jeff George really knows.